In the summer of 1934, the sky over Cale County, Oklahoma, turned black at noon. Not storm black, not rain black, dust black. A wall of it, taller than a building, wider than the horizon, rolling in from the west with the slow, unstoppable certainty of something that does not negotiate. The farmers who saw it coming from their fields stood completely still, not running, not calling to their families, just standing, watching something arrive that they had no category for. It lasted 4 hours. When it passed, when the air finally thinned enough to see more than 10 feet in any direction, Eldon Price walked to the edge of his north field and looked at what remained of the wheat crop he had planted in March. Nothing. Not flattened, not damaged. Gone. Buried under 6 inches of soil that had traveled from somewhere else and arrived on his farm without invitation and without apology. Eldon stood at that field for a long time. Then he turned around and walked back to his house. He did not tell Ruth what he was thinking. Not yet. Because what Eldon Price was thinking, standing at the edge of a destroyed field in the worst environmental disaster in American agricultural history, was not what any other farmer in Cale County was thinking. His neighbors were thinking about California. Eldon was thinking about what was underneath the dust. And what he knew about what was underneath that dust was about to become the only thing standing between the Price family and the same road west that every other family in the county was taking. But before we get to what Eldon knew, you need to feel what 1934 actually meant in Oklahoma. Because nothing about what he did makes sense unless you understand what he was choosing to stay inside. The drought had been building since 1930. 4 years of below-average rainfall. 4 years of soil that had been stripped of its natural grass cover by a decade of aggressive wheat farming. Soil that had lost its structure, lost its moisture, lost the biological engine that makes Earth capable of feeding people rather than simply existing as dirt. And in Oklahoma, in the 1930s, the wind always came. The Dust Bowl storms, the black blizzards as people called them, arrived in 1932. Small ones first. Inconvenient rather than catastrophic. Farmers cleaned their windows and went back to work. By 1934, they were not small anymore. The storm of May 1934 moved 350 million tons of soil across the Great Plains in a single event. It reached Chicago. It reached the Atlantic coast. Ships reported dust on their decks 500 miles out to sea. In Cale County, Oklahoma, it arrived on a Tuesday, and it arrived without mercy. The Harmon family left in June. 200 acres, 3 generations, packed what fit in the car and drove west on Route 66 with $40 and a hope that the California orange groves were hiring. The Becketts left in July, the Sullivans in August. By the autumn of 1934, a third of the farms in Cale County had been abandoned, houses left standing, doors unlocked, furniture still inside. The specific kind of leaving that happens when people decide that what they are leaving is worth less than the fuel it would take to go back for it. If you are watching The Harvest Empire for the first time, welcome. We tell the stories history forgot. Subscribe right now and hit the bell so you never miss one. Now, back to Eldon. Eldon Price watched all of it from his front porch. He watched the Harmons load their car. He watched the Beckett children wave from the back window as they drove past his fence line. He watched the Sullivan farm go dark one September evening and stay dark. And then he went back to his soil. Not to mourn it, to study it. Because here is what nobody in Cale County understood about Eldon Price in the autumn of 1934. He had not come to Oklahoma as a wheat farmer. He had come as a man who understood soil. His father had been a tobacco farmer in eastern Tennessee, a man who had learned through decades of working land that demanded careful management, that the relationship between a farmer and his soil was not a transaction. It was a conversation. You had to listen as much as you acted. You had to give back as much as you took. You had to understand what the specific piece of earth beneath your feet was capable of, and what it needed, and what it would refuse no matter how hard you pushed it. Eldon had carried that understanding from Tennessee to Oklahoma in 1918 and applied it to wheat farming in a county where most of his neighbors farmed the way the boom years encouraged. aggressively, expansively, with the assumption that more acreage and more yield was always the correct answer. Eldon had never fully believed that. He had farmed 180 acres, modest by county standards, and he had managed his soil with a rotation discipline that his neighbors found old-fashioned and that his yields did not always justify in the good years. But he had never stripped his land. He had never pushed it past what it could recover from. And in the summer of 1934, with 6 inches of foreign dust covering his north field, that discipline was about to matter more than it had ever mattered. Before we go further, drop a comment right now. If you had been in Eldon's position in 1934, would you have stayed or left? Tell us below. And if this story is speaking to you, share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Now here is where Eldon's story stops being about the Dust Bowl. Wait for it. Because what Eldon did in the autumn of 1934 was not what any agricultural expert of his era would have recommended. It was not what his remaining neighbors expected. It was not even what Ruth fully understood at first. He came to the barn one evening with a hand-drawn map of his property. He laid it on the workbench under the lamp, and he began marking sections. Ruth came to the barn door and watched him. "What are you thinking?" she said. He looked up. "I am thinking about which sections held," he said. Not which sections had survived undamaged. None of them had. But which sections, underneath the 6 inches of arrived dust, still had living soil, still had structure, still had the biological activity that made Earth capable of growing something rather than simply existing as a surface. Because here is what Eldon Price understood that nobody else in Cale County was thinking about. The dust storm had not destroyed the soil. It had buried it. There was a difference. A critical, life-saving difference. Beneath the 6 inches of foreign dust that had settled across his fields, beneath what looked from the surface like complete destruction, Eldon's soil was still there, still alive, still holding the organic matter and the biological structure that 18 years of careful management had built into it. And if he could get through the winter, if he could find a way to work with what the storm had left rather than against it, there was a path. Not easy, not guaranteed, but a path. What he planted that autumn was not wheat, not the crop that had defined Cale County farming for 20 years. Something different. Something his father had taught him in Tennessee as a soil recovery strategy, a technique so old-fashioned that none of the county extension agents in Oklahoma in 1934 would have thought to recommend it. Legumes, cover crops, nitrogen fixers. Plants whose purpose was not yield but restoration. Species whose root systems would hold the dust in place through the winter winds, whose biological activity would begin rebuilding the soil chemistry, whose presence in the ground would give the earth beneath them a chance to recover from what the drought had taken. He planted into what looked like destruction, because he knew it was not destruction. It was an opportunity wearing destruction's face. The winter of 1934 to 1935 was brutal. 3 more storms. Temperatures that dropped without warning. The remaining families in Cale County sealed their windows with wet rags and waited. Eldon worked through all of it. Every morning before the wind came up, he was in the fields, checking the cover crops, watching what the legumes were doing to the dust layer, how the root systems were threading down through the foreign soil and finding the living earth beneath it. He kept records in his notebook. Every section, every date, every observation. Ruth kept the household running through that winter on what they had preserved from the previous year. They did not talk about leaving. Not once. But there were nights, Ruth would say this years later, there were nights when Eldon came in from the fields and sat at the kitchen table and did not speak for a long time. She brought him coffee. She did not ask questions. She had been married to this man for 18 years, and she knew the difference between Eldon thinking and Eldon doubting. That winter, she saw both. Because here is what nobody tells you about the people who make the right decision in a crisis. They are not certain. They are afraid. They get up anyway. Eldon drank the coffee. He looked at his notebook. He went back outside. Because the cover crops needed tending regardless of whether he was right. And then, in March of 1935, Something happened on the Price farm that had not happened on most of the remaining farms in Cale County. Eldon went out at dawn and crouched at the edge of his north field. He pulled back the dust layer with his hands and stopped. Something green, barely visible. The first green thing on this property since the summer storms. He stared at it for a long time. Then he sat back on his heels and looked at the Oklahoma sky. Not the dust black of summer. Lighter. The suggestion of something changing. Leave a like right now if this story is holding you. We are almost at the turn. Stay with me. Spring came to Cale County in 1935. Slowly, cautiously, but it came. And on the Price farm things grew. Not dramatically, not the abundance of a perfect year. The slow, careful growth of soil that has been damaged and is recovering. Not healed yet, not fully itself, but moving in the right direction with the stubbornness of living things that have not decided to give up. The cover crops had done what Eldon knew they would do. The root systems had held the foreign dust in place through the winter storms. The nitrogen fixing had begun recharging the soil chemistry. The biological engine beneath the surface, the earthworms, the microorganisms, the living architecture that makes soil capable of growing food, had been protected through the winter and was waking up. His soil was not dead. It had never been dead. It had been waiting. Chester Webb was the closest neighbor who had stayed. He came to the fence line one morning in April. He looked at what Eldon's fields were doing. He stood there for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "How?" Just that one word. Eldon walked to the fence. He explained the cover crops, the rotation, the soil management his father had taught him in Tennessee. The difference between soil that had been stripped and soil that had been maintained. The reason the dust had buried his fields rather than taken them. Chester listened to every word. Then he said, "Will it work on my land?" Eldon looked at Chester's fields. He walked over, crouched down, pressed his hands into the soil on Chester's side of the fence. He looked at it for a moment. "It is going to take longer," Eldon said. "But yes." Chester nodded. "Tell me what to plant," he said. The Price farm harvest of 1935 was not spectacular. Eldon would be the first to say so. The yields were below what the farm had produced in its best years. Some sections were still recovering. The market prices were depressed by the broader agricultural crisis the Dust Bowl had created. It was not a year that made anyone rich, but it was a harvest, a real one, on land that every expert of 1934 would have written off as destroyed. On soil that 6 inches of foreign dust had covered and the entire county had assumed was gone. Eldon Price brought his harvest to the Cale County grain elevator in October of 1935. He was one of 4 farmers in the county who had anything to bring. The elevator manager, a man named Douglas Hale, who had been running the operation since 1921, looked at Eldon's load with an expression that took a long time to settle into something readable. Then he said, "How did you hold on?" Eldon told him. Douglas Hale listened. Then he picked up the telephone and called the County Agricultural Extension Office. The Extension Office sent 2 men to the Price farm the following week. They spent 2 days there. They walked every section. They took soil samples. They examined Eldon's records. They asked questions for hours. Eldon answered everything. Not because he wanted recognition, because he understood that knowledge kept private is just stubbornness. Knowledge shared is the only thing that actually changes anything. The Extension Office published a report in 1936 recommending cover crop rotation as a soil recovery strategy for Dust Bowl-affected farmland. It cited the Price farm as a case study. Eldon did not read the report. He was in his fields. Eldon Price farmed his 180 acres in Cale County, Oklahoma for 30 more years after the Dust Bowl. He never expanded. He never chased the boom years that followed the war with the aggressive growth that had contributed to the conditions that made the Dust Bowl possible in the first place. He farmed the same 180 acres with the same rotation discipline his father had taught him in Tennessee, and that the Oklahoma soil had rewarded when everything else in the county was failing. Chester Webb farmed alongside him through the 1940s and the 1950s. Three other families in Cale County adopted similar practices in the years following 1935. Of the farms that survived the Dust Bowl in Cale County, the ones that were not abandoned and never returned to, nearly all of them had one thing in common. A farmer who had understood something about the soil that the boom years had encouraged everyone to forget. That the land is not a factory, it is a partnership, and partnerships require listening. Eldon Price passed in 1961. He left the farm to his son James, who had grown up walking those fields and pressing his hands into that soil and understanding the way farm children understand things, not through words but through years of watching, why his father moved the way he moved and listened the way he listened. James kept the rotation. He taught his own children to keep it. The Price farm is still there. The soil is still alive. Not because the Dust Bowl did not come. It came. It buried everything. It took the neighbors and the families and the schools and the grain elevator and most of what Cale County had been in 1929. But it did not take the Price farm. Because Eldon Price had spent 18 years building something into his soil that 6 inches of foreign dust could bury but could not kill. He had built a relationship with it. Patient, attentive, reciprocal. The kind of relationship that the land rewards not in good years. Any farmer can survive a good year. But in the years when survival itself is the only harvest that matters. The land does not forget. It does not forget who stripped it and left. It does not forget who stayed and listened. And it does not forget the 18 years of careful conversation that made the difference between a farm the Dust Bowl buried and a farm the Dust Bowl could not kill. If Eldon's story stayed with you today, share it with one person, someone who is in the middle of something that looks like destruction and needs to be reminded that destruction and burial are not the same thing. Like this video. Subscribe if you have not. And leave a comment below. What has your family held on to through something that should have taken it? The next story on the Harvest Empire is already coming. By God's grace, we will see you there.